Shabbat Shalom, Mishpachah.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Our parsha today is Ackerman. You may remember last Shabbat, Danny got us started in the book of Devarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, when he focused on remembering. Israel was to remember where they had come from in order to be able to see what was ahead of them. And I would say that it's the same for us. What has gone before us with regard to Israel has prepared us and informed us of what is ahead of us and what will happen in the years to come. What we see is that the book of Deuteronomy was a time of final preparation for Israel. It was a time during which Moses reiterated many of the things which were taught before, the things which occurred during the time of the first generation. And now here today, we have the second generation sitting before him, and many of them in this generation may have never heard some of the things about which he spoke and was going to speak. And what we find as we read through Deuteronomy, that the information that he gave to them was very orderly, and it followed a very specific format, the format of a covenant. And so our message today begins with the idea of covenant as being suggested by the meaning of the word Deuteronomy. I think you all know that it means second law because it appears to be a restating of the Torah. Now that's quite a bit that we could say about our parsha today. One trail that we could follow would be to examine the parts of a covenant which we find in the book of Deuteronomy. And that is an interesting study, but we're not going to do that today. Another thing that we could focus on is the Shema in Deuteronomy 6. That's a great study. We've done that many times, and we know very well what the greatest commandment is, where it comes from. Deuteronomy 6 is the Shema, and then we have to go to Leviticus for the second greatest commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, today we're going to follow a little different path, a path which begins with the covenant at Sinai and then examines some other covenants. I think probably most of you have heard of Hammurabi's Code. Have you not? That's something that we read about in school. It was written by the Babylonian king Hammurabi 400 or more years before Israel came out of Egypt. So it had been around for a long time. But the covenant which Adonai established between himself and Israel was not based on this code. And I bring this up and I mention it because some people think that the two are similar, especially when you start talking about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Well, we know in the Torah, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth means financial repayment. Repay that which was taken away. Doesn't mean that you knock out an eye or pull out a tooth. But it is generally agreed by theologians that the covenant at Sinai and its restatement in Deuteronomy are most similar to the Hittite Suzerainty treaties. But what we see is that Hammurabi's Code was a law code. It was a document which stated what the law was, and then it prescribed the penalty, and it usually was a very harsh one, a harsh penalty for violating it. The Hittite Suzerainty treaties were much different, and the covenant at Sinai most resembled them. In the Hittite world of that time and a few hundred years before, the suzerain was the sovereign. That's the name for the sovereign. A king. And the treaty was an agreement between him and some lesser entity, maybe a prince or a lesser king. Now, what we find in these treaties is that the lesser king did have a degree of autonomy over his kingdom, but he was still subject to the overall rule of the suzerain, the great king. And that's the pattern which we see in the covenant at Sinai. Adonai is the suzerain, the great king, and Israel is the lesser autonomous nation under his overall rule. And if we take this metaphor even further, we might see Moses as being the prince. So what we see is that there are very significant differences between the benevolent suzerainty treaties and a law code such as Hammurabi's. We could characterize the suzerain, the great king, as a benevolent dictator, whereas the king of the law code was a tyrant, a cruel ruler. The suzerain treaty was administered with love and grace, whereas the law code was administered with force and threat of punishment. And the ancient rabbis looked at the difference between these two kinds of systems. They saw it as the difference between sonship and slavery. If you agree to Adonai's covenant, you're a son or a daughter. But if you're under a law code, you're a slave. A son agrees to, but a slave has to. And so what we see is that the pattern of the Hittite treaties is the general pattern of the covenant at Sinai. Now, along with that, we also like to look at the overall covenant in a symbolic Jewish way as being a form of a ketubah, a marriage document, a form of a contract between Israel, the bride, and the great king, Adonai. And now that the Messiah has come, we can also see the continuity of this and the continuation of the covenant through him, who he himself describes as the bridegroom. And we continue to walk today as his disciples under the conditions of the ketubah, the Torah, as we await Yeshua's return and the consummation of the marriage to him in eternity. So the major point that we are making here with regard to the covenant at Sinai is that our covenant is a love relationship rather than being a fear document of you have to or else. The ancient treaty patterns help us to see this, and that our relationship with Adonai is based on love and grace. So covenant is our focus today. And we find other covenants in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. So let's take a look at them. We begin with what is called the Identic Covenant. Some people consider what Adonai did through creation as a covenant. In Genesis 1:26 through 28, Elohim said, "Let us make man in our image and after our likeness." He said they will be created male and female, and they will have dominion over the earth. And God blessed them and told them to be fruitful and multiply, and to rule over all the creatures of the earth. One group of theologians considers this part of Genesis to be the Identic Covenant. There's another group, and there may be more, I've only looked at two. Another group considers the covenant to be found in the promise of death if the tree of knowledge of good and evil was eaten, along with God's curse upon the serpent, and the promise that the seed of the woman would crush his head and the serpent would crush his heel. So these events are promissory and they are prophetic, but they don't seem to have the usual characteristics of a covenant. But I think we would all agree that the seed of the woman crushing the head of the serpent is a prophetic reference to Yeshua defeating Hasatan. And so while this may have been covenantal in nature, it was not identified by Adonai as being a covenant. Then we have the Noahic covenant, covenant with Noah. Because Adam and Eve sinned, sin was unleashed on their descendants. And by Noah's time, it was so widespread that there were only 8 individuals living whom Adonai considered righteous. They were Noah and his wife and their 3 sons and their wives. And we had the entire world, perhaps 1 million people, somebody had figured out at that time, except for Noah and his family, that were wiped out in the flood. But what we see is that Adonai, after the flood, made a covenant with Noah, and he promised that never again will all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again will there be a flood to ruin the land. Now, what I want you not to confuse at this point, don't confuse this covenant with what is called the Noahide Covenant, which is an invention of Rabbinic Judaism. They propose that there are 7 laws given in Genesis 9, which, if obeyed by Gentiles, will cause them to be righteous before God. This, according to the rabbis, was one option for Gentiles to obtain right relationship with Adonai, along with the second option, which was conversion to Judaism. The Noahide covenant is totally bogus, whereas the Noahic covenant is from Adonai. Then we have the Abrahamic covenant. Even with the new beginning after the flood, man again began to sin, and sin abounded. And their desire to be like God resulted in their attempt at constructing the Tower of Babel. So we see plenty of sin there, but not any righteous people mentioned. But not long after this time, Adonai called another man from among the multitude. He called Abram. When Abram responded with faith, Adonai counted it to him as righteousness. And then some years later, he made a covenant with him, and he promised the land of Canaan as a future possession to his descendants. He commanded Abraham to circumcise himself and his household. And the sign of the eternal covenant made with Abraham was circumcision, something which was to be done on all Jewish males at 8 days of age forever. And then we have the priestly covenant. In Exodus 29:44, Adonai stated that he would sanctify Aaron and his sons to serve before him as priests. In a recent message we saw in Numbers 18, where Adonai promised that what was set aside of the offerings of the tabernacle was to be a permanent share for Abraham's children, and it was guaranteed with a covenant of salt, an everlasting covenant. So that was as long as the tabernacle and the temple was present. but we no longer have them. In addition to that was, which we read recently in Numbers 25:13, because of Phinehas' righteous act of killing the Israelite man and the Moabite woman, Adonai promised him and his descendants a covenant of everlasting priesthood. Then we come to the covenant at Sinai, the Mosaic covenant. Adonai told Abraham that his descendants would live in a land that was not theirs for 400 years. But he promised that he would free Abraham's descendants from that land and that they would go out with many possessions. And that's exactly what we saw, isn't it? They came out with all kinds of gold and silver and jewelry. Through an act of his grace toward the children of Israel, God judged Pharaoh, he judged the gods of Egypt, and he rescued the 12 tribes. Promising that Israel would be priests to the nations, Adonai cut a covenant with them at Mount Sinai. The covenant was initially summarized in the 10 words, with the subsequent Torah, the teaching and instruction that followed, being given during the later years. Then we have the Davidic Covenant. Adonai made a covenant with King David that his descendants would always be on the throne of Israel. Through the prophet Nathan in 2 Samuel 7, he said that he would raise up David's descendant and establish his kingdom forever. Referring to the coming one, the Messiah, 1 Chronicles 17 says, I will appoint him over my house and my kingdom forever, and his throne will be established forever. Then we come to the new covenant. During the prophet Jeremiah's lifetime, the kingdom of Judah was in the process of being judged by Adonai for their sins, and subsequently during Jeremiah's life, the temple was destroyed. What we have seen here is that the northern kingdom of Israel had been judged 100 years before, and most of their people had been deported to Assyria. Through Jeremiah, Adonai promised to redeem all that and to give a new covenant to Judah and Israel, a covenant in which he would write his Torah on their hearts. The covenant was cut, was put into effect some 600 years later through the sacrificial death of Adonai's son Yeshua, who was a permanent sacrifice for sin. So we've seen some features of the covenant as expressed in the book of Deuteronomy in these 7, which some consider to be the covenants given by Adonai. The Identic Covenant was given to Adam and Eve's descendants. That's everyone on the earth. The Noahic was given to Noah's descendants, which is everyone on the earth. The Abrahamic was given to Abraham's descendants, the Jews of today. The priestly covenant was given to Aaron and his descendants. The Davidic covenant was given to the male descendants of David, including Yeshua, our Messiah. The Mosaic covenant was given to the 12 tribes of Israel, and the new covenant was given to Israel and Judah, who during that time were separated. So our question is, what bearing, if any, do these have on us today? If the Edenic was actually a covenant, we as descendants of Adam and Eve have been told to rule over the whole earth and to expect that the seed of the woman, whom we understand to be Yeshua, will defeat the serpent, Hasatan, the adversary. As descendants of Noah, we are confident in Adonai's promise to not destroy the inhabitants of the earth again by flood. The Abrahamic covenant applies only to the Jews, the descendants of Abraham. They have been promised the land of Israel as a permanent homeland, something which has only been partially fulfilled today. The atonement earlier available through the Mosaic covenant and the Levitical priesthood has been superseded by the better atonement of the new covenant and the eternal priesthood of Yeshua. But we note that the laws of the Mosaic covenant are still on the books. They're still there. God did not blot them out. Some are inactive due to the lack of a temple in which to carry them out. But the laws, the Torah, the teaching and instruction which is given in the 5 books of Moses, those which are not affected by the lack of the temple and a Levitical priesthood, are available today to all who can receive them. As Shaul said in our Shlichim reading today, do we nullify the Torah? Heavens no, we uphold it. So today, the new covenant is the active covenant under which Yeshua's followers live. In it, Adonai's Torah has been written on our hearts, and we are obedient to it as a matter of conscience, along with the additional Torah commands which we find in the writings of Yeshua's emissaries, the Beit Hadashah. And I think you know that somebody has counted them and said that there are 1,050 in those scriptures. They're all there for us. After we have trusted in Yeshua by faith through Adonai's grace, and we've received the promise of salvation and eternal life, we then begin to walk in these commands. The following of the commands found in the Tanakh and those in the Brit Hadashah have nothing whatsoever to do with a person's salvation. They are obeyed after salvation as a sign of love and commitment to Yeshua, our Messiah. So again, we mentioned that covenants is our general theme today. And for more information about covenants, we go to Shaul. I think because of his encounter with Yeshua and the information which he received about many, many things from Yeshua, he seems to have a greater insight regarding covenants as they relate to our relationship with Adonai through Yeshua. So I want to begin today in Ephesians 1. If you look at the congregation at Ephesus, we find that it included both Jews and Gentiles, and Shaul spoke to both of them with regard to their relationship with Yeshua. We first established the basic understanding of our relationship with him. Shaul says, in him we have redemption through his blood, the removal of trespasses in keeping with the richness of his grace. And then we move on to verse 13. After you have heard the message of truth, the good news of your salvation, and when you put your trust in him, you were sealed with the promised Ruach HaKodesh. He is the guarantee of our inheritance until the redemption of his possession to his glorious praise. So in this, Shaul was saying that we who have trusted Yeshua have received the Ruach Kodesh, the Holy Spirit, as the guarantee of our redemption. Our redemption is promised us, and it's guaranteed by the Holy Spirit until Yeshua comes back to earth to physically redeem us, or we go to meet him before then. We continue in chapter 2. I'm going to use a paraphrase here of Shalom's words in verses 1 through 10. He told Gentiles that they were spiritually dead because of their unforgiven sins, because they walked in the way of the world, and because they acted according to Hasatan, who is the ruler of the realm of the air. Speaking of Jews, he said that they also did not do right, and they lived for the hunger of what their bodies and minds craved. And then going back and speaking to both Jews and Gentiles, he said that Adonai was merciful to both groups, to Jews and Gentiles, because of his great love. And even while all of us, Jew and Gentile, were still spiritually dead because of our sins, he gave us life in Messiah through grace. And he said that Adonai raised us, Jew and Gentile, up with Yeshua and gave us a place with him in the heavens. And we will, in the world to come, show us the great richness of his grace through our Messiah, Yeshua. He also reiterated that we have been saved by faith through Adonai's grace, and that it was a complete gift of God, and that we cannot boast about it, because our salvation is not based on our deeds. We are the creations of Messiah Yeshua, who are created in order to do good deeds which Adonai prepared for us earlier so that we could walk in them. And what I've just gone over is pretty much what everyone understands until we get to that last part about the deeds. Verse 10 says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Messiah Yeshua for good deeds, which God prepared beforehand so we might walk in them." So he's saying that we are created in Messiah Yeshua. That is, we are saved by faith through grace in order to walk in good deeds. Looking at the Greek word translated deeds in the TLV is ergois. And according to Strong's, this means works. The word translated as walk is peripatesomai, and it means to walk. So what he's saying is we are to walk in works. Now, I'm coming up on something here which I think most of you know. In Rabbinic Judaism, the Hebrew word halak, meaning walk, is the word from which the word halakha, meaning how we walk, is derived. Halakha is the established understanding of how one is to walk in the Torah. Rabbinic Judaism establishes halakha, how their followers are to walk in. That is, how they are to obey the commands of Torah. As Messianic followers of Yeshua, we do the same. But our halakha is different because of our Messianic understanding of Torah. But the point that I'm making is that it certainly seems that halakha was that which Shaul was referring to in Ephesians 2:10 when he said walk. That which Adonai prepared in advance is the Torah. And after salvation, as Yeshua's Talmudim, as his disciples, we are to halak. We are to walk in his Torah. Moving on to the next verse. In Ephesians 2:11, Shaul spoke to the Gentiles. He told the Gentiles, he told the Ephesians, and those of us who are Gentile today, that as the people of the nations, they were called the uncircumcised by the Jews, the ones who were called the circumcised because they had had an operation in their flesh. He said, at that time you were separate from Messiah, excluded from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. As you look at that verse, we can understand the part about being separate from Messiah. We can understand about not being citizens of Israel, Gentiles before they knew Messiah. We can all understand that we had no hope and we were without God in the world. But what about the rest of this verse, the part that I have underlined? What does it mean? Seeking to determine its meaning will be the primary focus of the remainder of our message. And as I began to study for this message earlier in the week, I discovered that my understanding of that phrase, strangers to the covenants of promise, might be incorrect. Most English translations that you read about this phrase, and even the TLV, as you can see, seem to have missed something very important. For comparison purposes, here is the phrase in several different Bible versions. The TLV says, strangers to the covenants of promise. The New King James Version says, strangers from the covenants of promise. The New American Standard Bible says, strangers to the covenants of promise. And the Complete Jewish Bible says, estranged from the national life of Israel. I am not a theologian, and I don't know why the translator translated the versions in that way. But they don't seem to line up with what the Greek text says. In the Strong's Concordance, the direct English translation of the Greek text is strangers to the covenants of the promise. And surprisingly, the New International Version is translated that way. It says, foreigners to the covenants of the promise. And this is because the Greek includes the word tain. It means the. And for me, this is a whole new way of looking at this phrase. What we see in the Greek is that the word covenants is plural, but the word promise is singular, and it has the definite article the. So we're not talking about a number of covenants which promise something, but a number of covenants which refer to something called the promise. That's what we need to find out about, the promise. What is it? Well, if we stop and think for a moment, we can find a passage with similar wording by Shaul somewhere else in his writings. Just a little bit of mental gymnastics can show us what seems to be a very significant connection between Shaul's statement to the Ephesians and a statement he made to the Galatians. And we spoke about this very verse in Galatians just a few weeks ago when we were studying Galatians 4. And the son of the bondmaiden was born through flesh, but the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now, you will recognize that as being my Hebraized version of the King James Version, which I created for my original Galatians study in 2001. What we understand here is that the son of the bondmaiden, Hagar, that Rabbi Herb was talking about just a moment ago, was Ishmael. And the son of the free woman, Sarah, was Isaac. But the way I wrote it was incorrect, and I have now corrected it to read, the son of the free woman was born through the promise. The Greek of Galatians 4:23 includes the word tain, the very same word found in Ephesians 2:12, means the. In both these verses, Shaul referred to the promise. And we must conclude from this that he was referring to a very specific promise from Adonai relating to certain covenants. So what is the actual promise to which he referred? The actual promise was originally spoken to Abraham by Adonai in Genesis 12, and then it was restated by Shaul in Galatians 3:8. The scriptures foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith proclaimed the good news to Abraham in advance, saying, all the nations shall be blessed through you. That is the promise. Now, certainly we know Adonai gave Abraham other promises, which we mentioned, the land of Israel. But this is the one to which Shaul referred to as the promise. So we want to further understand what Shaul was telling us here, and in order to try to do that, I have examined several references to what is described as a promise theme proposed by several different Bible scholars. But I'm only going to focus on information from just one. It is what Dr. Walter C. Kaiser, a very respected theologian, detailed in his book, The Promised Plan of God, a biblical theology of the Old and New Testaments. His theory is that the promise theme began in Genesis 3:15 with God's promise to Eve that her sin, her seed, her descendant would crush the head of the serpent, Hasatan, the adversary. From that point, the promise continued to be revealed by future covenants. The Noahide Covenant was a promise of the continuation of the human race. That was a part of the promise. The Abrahamic Covenant included a veiled promise of the good news, a promise of the gospel, which you can read about in Genesis 12:2 and 3, and which we just read a moment ago that Shaul spoke about in Galatians 3:8. The promise continues in the Mosaic Covenant, in that the giving of Adonai's Torah leads to Messiah. Now, as we said a moment ago, today you can't be saved through the Mosaic Covenant, but it is still active in revealing the Messiah. And Shaul referred to this in Romans 10. For Messiah is the goal of the Torah as a means of righteousness for everyone who keeps trusting. So it is still very, very important. We know that Messiah is not the end of the law, as so many Bibles state about this verse, but that Messiah is the goal found within the law, the Torah, the teaching and instruction which those who diligently look for will find. And we note that Yeshua's disciples were some who found him that way. That was all they had. The promise theme is also found in the Davidic Covenant, which gave the promise of Messiah and made it specific to the line of David, from whom comes our Messiah, Yeshua. And finally, the promise is found in the New Covenant, which, when taken in its entirety, promises the final ingathering of Israel and all who are joined to Israel through faith in the Messiah, Yeshua. So if what Dr. Kaiser has proposed is correct, which then are the covenants of promise? It's the six which we have just listed: the Edenic, the Noachic, the Abrahamic, the Mosaic, the Davidic, and the New Covenant. They are all covenants of promise, or at least they are promises in some sort of covenant form. The only one which is not a covenant of promise is the priestly covenant, the one made with Aaron and his descendants. The other six reveal a promise from Adonai to his creation, to the people of the earth. It's a promise to everyone, a promise to all nations, but he chose Abraham's descendants to tell everybody about it. Galatians 3:8 and Ephesians 2:12, as we have just examined them more closely, have tipped us off to something wonderful. The promise found in the covenants is ultimately the Beshirat Hagula, the good news, the gospel of Yeshua HaMashiach, which Abraham saw from afar and he rejoiced. Yeshua mentioned this. He was speaking to a group of Pharisees and he said, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day." He saw it and he was thrilled. Well, after speaking about the promise, Shaul continued, "But now in Messiah Yeshua, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of the Messiah." It is the blood of the Messiah, the promise which brings both Jew and Gentile near. We all must trust in him. And through that trust, Gentiles are now citizens of the Commonwealth of Israel along with Jews. The next verses following this about the dividing wall and the one new man are important verses. But we're going to have to leave them for a later message. We will get back to them. As recipients of Adonai's great love and the salvation which we have received through Yeshua our Messiah, we must remember why we are what we are. For we are his workmanship, created in Messiah Yeshua for good deeds, which God prepared beforehand so we might walk in them. Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.